Okay, this is a slideshow giving you some pointers about how to analyse literary texts via a Marxist critical interpretation. So a little bit of background first. You might find this a little bit daunting, the idea of the sound just of the language, Marxist interpretation, but it is something that I think everybody can engage with. And should be quite accessible for many students, I think. Something that they can actually get their teeth into. Who was Karl Marx? Well, if you don't know who Karl Marx was, he's a very famous figure in terms of the history of political theory about how societies might and should be run. He lived between 1818 and 1883, so in the 19th century. As I said, he was a political theorist, so he had ideas about how society should be organised, and he wrote a lot about them. And to boil down his ideas in a very basic concept, he saw the history of society as having been, up until that point, a series of struggles between social classes, between people who had money and power and people who had far less money and power. So between the oppressed and the oppressing. So he sees history of society as a struggle. Two words that are really, really important in terms of talking about Marx, and they sound very complicated, but they're really not, are the nouns bourgeoisie, which was a term he used to describe the moneyed classes in power of business and factories. He called that the means of production. So those people who owned the factories that built and made things, basically. So if you look back in society, it would have been, the king and his noblemen, the landowners, basically. If you move forward to the 19th century, it's the factory owners, and the government to an extent, but people who owned factories obviously became far more powerful in the 19th century. The other word to use to describe the opposite really was the proletariat, who were the workers who he saw as being exploited by the moneyed classes, the bourgeoisie. So when you're thinking about Marx, he sees history as a struggle between the bourgeoisie, the moneyed classes, and the proletariat, the workers. Okay, so that's a little bit of background about Marx. Okay, according to Marx, he saw human history as would follow the following stages in society. Stage one he saw as feudalism. So that was one of the more basic forms that society was organised into. So that would have had the king at the top who had absolute power, so such as in a play Macbeth, which is set in medieval Scotland. Then beneath that you had the nobles and the church officials. The church had lots of money and power at that time. Then below that you had the knights and vassals. And then right at the bottom you had the serfs and peasants who had no power whatsoever, and they didn't own any land either. Okay, so that was the first stage of society that he saw as existing. He saw stage two as bourgeois capitalism. Okay, so here we have the bourgeoisie, the moneyed classes, the factory owners, who actually owned private businesses who competed against each other. And those private businesses, factories, tried to make profits, basically. They were driven by making profits, and that was usually at the expense of, obviously, the workers. Okay, so that was stage two. He believed that you'd have a breakdown in terms of a society organised by royalty and noblemen, the feudal society, but that would move towards private capitalism, which was different. There was an opportunity, for instance, for somebody quite low class to become a moneyed businessman, even factory owner in the 19th century, and that did happen. So in some respects this was, a society that had more opportunity than feudalism, but it was still a society based on on exploitation of powerful people over less powerful people. Stage 3 he saw as socialism, and that was basically revolution, where it would hit breaking point, where the exploited workers would actually rise up against the bourgeoisie, and you'd have a breakdown of the capitalist system and an attempt to organise society on a more equal footing, where wealth was shared, where the means of production were owned by everybody. And this would ultimately result, according to Marx, his political theory, he saw capitalism as basically doomed. It would resolve itself into a communist utopia where society was perfected in its ability to share resources and power equally among the people. Everyone was equal and the same. Now, obviously, that's never really happened. You could say communism, true communism or socialism, has existed in some small communities, but there's never been a nation state that you could truly say was run on socialist or communist principles successfully for a long period of time. So that was his theory about how history was moving. And in the 19th century, you're obviously in the stage of bourgeois capitalism, but he believed that socialist revolutions were beginning to happen. Obviously, you'd had the French Revolution, but he didn't see that as a successful communist revolution. And as you move into the 20th century, obviously, the rise in communism and communist revolutions did actually occur, but they didn't end up in communist utopias. So, what's this got to do with reading novels, plays and poetry? It's a good question to ask. Why on earth do we need to consider Marx and his strange political ideas about how society might progress and develop, and how it probably should progress and develop? He believed in a socialist communist utopia, and that would be better for society than capitalism. But what's this got to do with reading novels, plays and poetry? Well, Marx and other political thinkers believe that literature, novels, poems and plays, reflect the societies they are produced in. They reveal characters' materialism, which basically means whether they buy into that system of making money, of owning things, and that giving them prestige and power. And it also reveals the struggle between the classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So when you're looking at a novel, a poem or a play, Marx and other thinkers believed that could reveal something about the society in which it was written. So a sophisticated reader of literature might be a reader who considers some of Marx's ideas, basically. They look for how the text is produced on a political level, how it reflects political systems, the economic system in which it was produced. So these are some of the things that I would expect a good student to consider. Not all of them, but they might consider some of these when they're analysing a poem, play or novel. What role does class play in the work? What is the author's analysis of class relations? So which characters might represent the proletariat and which might represent the bourgeoisie? Are these two classes struggling within the text? Are they at war with each other? Do we think that the writer is actually suggesting that the system, the political and economic system that the characters live in is unfair? Does he promote the idea of capitalism and competition, or does he suggest that maybe society needs to be more equal? Another thing you could think about is, how do characters overcome oppression? So what does the writer seem to say about how people can rise up against oppression if they are less powerful in society? You could consider, in what ways does the work serve as propaganda for the status quo, or does it try to undermine it? It has nothing to do with the band Status Quo. Status quo really meant how its society exists at the moment. So does it promote this idea that society, a capitalist society, is a good thing, or does it try to undermine and argue against capitalist society? Does it make you think that the world we live in, or the world the characters live in rather, is a fair and a decent world, or is it a flawed world that maybe we need to address and perhaps work towards changing? What does the work say about oppression, or are social conflicts ignored or blamed elsewhere? So, what opinion does it take of people who are oppressed and made to feel less powerful and equal in society? Or does it actually ignore those social realities? Does the work finally propose some form of utopian vision as a solution to the problems encountered in the work? So some texts might suggest that there is a way of creating a better society, as Marx himself believed. So you might use the language progressive or regressive. Progressive being, in Marxist terms, yes, society can move towards a more perfect and equal utopian ideal. Regressive might be a text that actually suggests that that's unachievable, and actually, maybe capitalism and oppression and class struggle are just realities of the world and we need to accept them. Okay, so progressive in terms of Marxist views would be the text promotes a utopian vision, some socialist ideal, whereas regressive would be a text that doesn't really believe that is possible, perhaps. So, when you're coming to a text, such as Macbeth, you can apply some of the following sort of sentence starters to help you engage with a literary text from a political Marxist viewpoint. So, I feel the character is symbolic of the which class and represents, what about that class. From a political perspective, I feel the author is anti or pro-capitalist, so does he seem regressive or progressive in terms of his views about capitalism? That division of society between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. I feel from a Marxist viewpoint the text is regressive or progressive. So, as I said, does it promote the idea of socialism or does it go against that? Here's an example of just writing about one quote. It's a very short quote, it's one word, but I'm using those sentence starters to show you how you might engage with a Marxist reading. I feel the character of Lady Macbeth is symbolic of the moneyed classes and represents the greed that an unequal political system encourages. Her demands to unsex herself is a demand to dehumanise herself in the pursuit of money and power. From a political perspective, I feel Shakespeare is to some extent anti-capitalist, as even though he was writing centuries before Marx, he encourages us to see the damage a feudal economic system does when it encourages jealousy, ambition and competition, which leads to a breakdown in society. However, the text may be seen as regressive, as it was written for monarch James I, and the ending with Malcolm instated as king encourages an audience to perhaps see feudalism as just and fair when in the hands of a noble king. So that's just an example of how you can use some of these sentence starters to engage with a Marxist reading, even with a text that was written centuries, hundreds of years, and set, nearly 1,000 years before Marx is living. So Macbeth is set during feudal times. It certainly is a text that you can unpick from a kind of economic and political viewpoint. Basically, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are middle class to some extent. They're middle kind of setted nobility, and they have an ambition to move up that social ladder and gain more wealth and power, and they do so in a ruthless way. So you can certainly, from a Marxist perspective, see the text as highlighting the negative aspects of a competitive economic system, such as feudalism in medieval Scotland. Okay, so when you're coming to a text, whether it be a poem, a play, or a novel, those are some ideas, hopefully, that will help you engage with a Marxist reading.